All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, again. In the interest of time, I'm going to go fairly quickly through this question on whether or not we're going to see wage expansion and wage growth after 10 years of expansion in 2019, so that we have time to take your questions and stay on schedule this afternoon. But if we look at this question, after 10 years of expansion, will wages finally rise? One of the things that you might look at that question and react to it by saying, well, we've already seen that wages are rising. We've shown how total income has been rising. So what do we mean exactly when we're asking this question, will wages finally rise? What does that actually mean? So let's just take a moment and define what this conundrum is really all about. What do we mean when we say this? What's the problem that we're trying to address? And so we can define it very simply by looking first at the labor market. As we've already heard this afternoon, the labor market is doing very well. The job market, both from a national and a state level perspective. This shows us the unemployment rate, the national unemployment rate currently at 3.7%. South Carolina 3.3%. It's been tapering down over the last several years in this expansion. And in fact, in 2018, the blue line here represents the job openings rate, which is now higher than the U.S. unemployment rate. So that means that now we have fewer people unemployed than we do have jobs that are open. So this is a great situation if you happen to be a worker in the jobs market, less so if you happen to be an employer. So the labor market, the jobs market looks very strong right now. So we would expect that in a strong jobs market, we would be seeing fairly sizable wage growth, but this is what the picture actually looks like. So yes, wages are rising. This is average hourly earnings, but we're not close to the point where we were at the end of the previous expansion period. And to put a fine point on this, we have now been under 4.5% unemployment in the United States for over a year. 4.5% unemployment is the best that the United States got to during the previous expansion period. So we've been doing better from a job market perspective, at least from an unemployment rate, for over a year, and yet we still don't have wage growth that has achieved the level that we saw during the previous expansion. So that's really what the conundrum is all about. Why haven't we seen better wage growth given the health or the apparent health of the labor market? And this is a puzzle. This is our Fed chair, Jerome Powell, who's been asked about this problem multiple times, and he admits it's a bit of a puzzle. So economists don't have a good answer for this, at least not a simple answer. But what I want to spend the next couple of minutes going through with you on is just a set of hypotheses that are all likely partially contributing factors to this ongoing problem that we have. And in South Carolina in particular, it's important to recognize that wages are not the only source of income. Transfer payments, notably Social Security, is another significant component, and as you can see, that's actually growing as a percentage of total income because of the aging population that is attracted to South Carolina, because we have a large retiree base that is constantly migrating to South Carolina. So we see some changes that have occurred over the last 18 years. So just briefly, what are the three contributing factors to this wage conundrum that we hear so much about? Unobserved labor market slack is one, lower productivity is two, and changes in the hiring models that companies are working with is number three. So just very briefly, what does it mean by unobserved labor market shock? What do we mean when we, or slack, what do we mean when we say that? The bottom line is that we mean that unemployment is higher than it initially appears from traditional measures of unemployment. And how do we actually observe this? A simple way to observe this is to first acknowledge the difference between recovery and expansion. That is, when we're experiencing a period of economic growth, during the early part of what we call an expansion, it's really a recovery. And this is a way to see it from the perspective of total employment in South Carolina. You can see we marked the employment high before we went into the recession in 2008. And you can see that it took several years for us to basically gain back all of the jobs that we lost. And so we denote that more of an economic recovery as opposed to a genuine expansion period, which we typically refer to as a period when we're gaining new ground. So when we're achieving a job level that we hadn't achieved before. So just think about recovery versus expansion. So with that in mind, let's think about a couple of different metrics of unemployment and of labor market data, and just keep this in mind, recovery versus expansion in terms of where we are. If we look at labor force participation, This is one way that we can think about recovery versus expansion. Now here, the blue line represents labor force participation for those in the heart of in the labor force that we anticipate are working on a regular basis. That is, those between the ages of 25 and 54. You can see that ticking up beginning in about 2013 compared to the population as a whole, which is represented by the red line. But if we zone in on it and we look at labor force participation just for that age group, 25 to 54, and we compare where we are now to where we were back in 2007, consider recovery or expansion. If we look at the unemployment rate for the U.S. as a whole, we can look at the standard unemployment rate. We can also look at the broader measure of unemployment, known as the U6. So the U3 is the standard measure of unemployment. U6 is a broader measure that also includes people who have dropped out of the labor force because they basically have given up looking for work because they haven't had success, and also people working part-time for economic reasons, that is, only because they can't find a full-time job. So by these measures, we're actually doing fairly well. We're below in both metrics where we were in before the recession began back in 2007. But if we just focus on those employed part-time for economic reasons, once again, think about recovery versus expansion. So a critical threshold there that we haven't hit. But we have hit this threshold, it turns out, in South Carolina. So just compare the two, same metric, same data series that we're looking at, one for the US level and one for South Carolina, recovery versus expansion. And this explains why, or partly why, we're seeing such a major labor force shortage in South Carolina that employers are constantly referencing and are constantly talking about. So that's one aspect of this wage puzzle, is simply the fact that we are seeing labor market slack in certain areas that typically isn't revealed with normal unemployment data or normal job market data. Second reason has to do with productivity. And productivity has been very low. Productivity growth has been very low in this current expansion period. We can see this if we look at the average annual productivity growth rate going back to the 1990s. So these are the last three expansion periods. And you can see productivity has been very low, relatively speaking, compared to the early 2000s and compared to the 1990s. And sure enough, as you would expect, productivity very highly correlated to wage growth. In fact, they're close to being one and the same from a theoretical perspective. So we look at productivity and we would say, all right, if we see productivity goes up in the early 2000s and then significantly drops off, that should be affecting wage growth and the rate of wage growth that we're seeing. And it turns out that that's exactly the case. So if we look at these trends in productivity and then compare that to average hourly earnings over the past three expansion periods, what you'll notice is that the length of time it takes for us to get to a level of wage growth that we were at during at the peak of the previous expansion period, it correlates directly with the amount of productivity that we're seeing. So here we see productivity at the highest in between 2001 and 2007, second highest in the 90s, and then a distant third where we are today. And again, that ties very nicely to this chart here that shows the length of time it takes to get from one wage peak to a second wage peak, 6 years versus 8 years versus 11 years and counting. So productivity matters, and that's been one reason that we've seen sluggish wage growth. And then finally, changes in hiring practices. So we typically think about signing bonuses as something associated with an athlete, right? So you think about a Major League Baseball player or an NFL player getting this huge signing bonus. That's kind of the way we think about the term. But it turns out that signing bonuses are becoming more quote-unquote normal as a more normal hiring pattern for employers. And there's a very specific reason for this, that we're seeing some changes in hiring practices, known as a concept economists call a recession wage floor. And the logic is that in an economic downturn, if a company has to cut labor costs, there are basically three ways they can do it. They can either lay off workers, they can reduce the number of the worker hours, or they can reduce worker pay. And of those three, the last thing you want to do is reduce worker pay, because that is a killer of company morale. So that is an absolute last resort. So if you're coming out of a major recession period and you're worried about making long-run commitments to increasing your cost of labor, namely through raises, how might you get around that problem and still be able to reward employees? Well, one way to do it is to change your hiring practice or your pay model more to a sales-based model or a Salesforce-based model where you're paying a base plus a commission effectively. And so if we were to see that in the data, we might expect that the growth in pay or the growth in cost for employers for their employees would be reflected more in bonuses and supplemental pay than it is for wages themselves. And in fact, this is exactly what we have seen in recent years. So you can see that the annualized growth in employer costs per hour worked very much higher for supplemental pay and non-productivity bonuses than for the overall growth for total compensation and wages and salaries. So again, we're beginning to see a transition or a change in the hiring models of employers, which is creating a factor here in terms of wage growth and affecting the way that it's measured in terms of what we're seeing. So finally, what does this mean for South Carolina? Well, here we can see the major sectors of the state. The spheres represent the size of each industry relative to South Carolina, and you can actually see the U.S. average there in a star. We obviously didn't want to put a sphere there because it would dwarf everything else. But basically what this graph is showing us is employment growth, total employment growth going all the way back to 2010 on the x-axis and wage growth on the y-axis. So this gives you a flavor for which industries have been contributing most in South Carolina to wage growth and employment growth. And as you can see, the industries tend to be clustered either in the bottom right, meaning high employment growth and low wage employment growth, high wage growth. And in fact, if we look at the industry that has been driving our wage growth, where we've seen the most wage growth is in manufacturing. So the way you can see that is just look at the bubble that's the highest on the vertical axis, on the y-axis. So you can see in green there, manufacturing generating the most wage growth. So we would expect that we're seeing more productivity gains in manufacturing than other sectors in the state, and it turns out to be that is exactly the case, 2.7% over 0.5%, an annualized average annual growth rate going back to the early parts of this expansion period. So this has been very positive, especially for manufacturing. But even in manufacturing, if we translate this into real wage figures, that is, we take out the effects due to inflation, you can compare the two, and regardless of which industry we're looking at, wage growth remains fairly weak, certainly through 2018. So a major difference here, and it makes inflation all the more important to be monitoring in 2018 and going into 2019. And then if we look at a map of the state, we can get a perspective on what wage growth has been doing across South Carolina. So we see the highest wage gains occurring along the coastal regions of the state. This is driven largely by manufacturing, but in Charleston in particular, where we've seen, and the coastal regions more generally, where we've seen high wage growth, we have to keep in mind that the coastal areas have multiple sectors that have seen higher than average wage growth. So that's really what's driving this region of the state. Again, this is very different from looking from an industry perspective overall, but this just gives you a flavor for what the distribution looks like statewide. So the bottom line, nominal wage growth is picking up as we head into 2019, and that's especially going to continue as we see some of these what we're calling recovery metrics, recovery periods transition into more expansion-oriented periods. Productivity certainly remains a key concern, and so in 2019, we are keeping our eye very closely tied to inflation and really the relationship between nominal wage growth, which we expect to pick up in 2019, and that battling against inflation is going to be the key to watch as we move ahead. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention, and I'm going to ask Dr. Woodward to come back, and we'll be happy to answer your questions and then close out this afternoon.